Hello everyone. Today we will demonstrate how to automatically register actions, which are the actions within saaspilot, how we can test via Playground, right? Before we deploy it in your SS, in your product. So when you enter, right, you log into the platform here in Aurora DApp, we will already find, an alert saying that we don't have any action registered, giving us the link here for us to go to the action section, or also, right, the option for us to click on the help center, where we can see some videos or articles related to any doubt I might have. So for our scenario, we will click on actions. Once we clicked on actions, you can see that we don't have any API mapped. Right? So in a very simple way, right, actions are actions that your API can execute. And not just actions of your API, right? You can add APIs that you use, Let's suppose I use HubSpot, then I could register here the URL of HubSpot, the API of HubSpot, map the actions I need, and use my API key there, right, to be able to communicate with HubSpot and so on. So here we can include both your APIs of your product, of your SaaS, as well as, right, others that you need to use in your workflow. So we can create these actions automatically, right, and dynamically using an open API specification file. A vast majority of providers already have this file. Many might have a URL that exposes this definition, and if your API doesn't, you can add it manually. In this video, we will go through the process automatically, right, using an open API file. In the next video, we cover, right, how I would do this manually. So the first thing I have to do here is either I will click on upload, right, both here and up here. And then our screen will appear for us to do the upload of the specification. So either we drag a file here where we have the file upload, or we take the URL and place it directly here where we have the fetch. For this video, I created an example file using JSON placeholder, right, which is an API of example, mapping only the user root, right? So I'll put it here. Once I pasted it, I do a fetch. It processed, right? We can see that it created up here, right? And it already created the cards for the user's path. What's cool about doing it through a URL is that you can keep synchronizing, Let's suppose this update user by ID didn't exist, right? So I did it like this. I uploaded via URL the first time. There were only these 5, right? Without this 6th one here, let's simulate this. In other words, there were only these 5. And during this time, which the new paths were created, new routes were created, and I want to synchronize. So once you use the URL, when you click on upload, the URL will already be selected here. Then just do a fetch again, and it will check the definitions, see if there's anything new, and download. It automatically created what was missing here. The others remained the same. Once we've done the import, either through the file or through a URL, I can make some changes, right? And I can also do some checks. The first one is to see how we are specifying the host part, the authentication parts, if I need to pass any headers, right? So here where I have the JSON placeholder, right, which is the name of the file, the API, the open API specification that I imported. If I click on the gear, I have some fields to customize. First, we have the name of the API, right? If you want to change this name that came dynamically from the definition of the open API, you can change it. Here, it automatically already grabs for us and brings the host. And here we have 2 situations, right? We can use our API. Most APIs that we use have authentication, including your own SaaS, your own product. You can use it through the authentication component or through the header. What is the difference between the two? When we use the authentication component, we can choose the name of the key here, right? Whether it is authorization, XAPI key, access token. Anyway, we can define it, and you don't insert the value. You can insert the value. The value is even disabled here. You can specify what type it is, right? And here you would place the value. Obviously, you can't. Why? Because the idea of this authentication component is that you provide the API key, the authentication key, every time you make a request to the agent. So once I registered my API and mapped it, when I call the agent, I am obligated to provide the API key, so it can take this key and use it to make requests to your APIs or if you don't want to keep entering it with each request, you can add fixed headers. So you can put here in the same way as it would be the X API key, right? You can put X API key here and put the value of your key here. Then every time the agent interacts with this API, it will automatically have all the authentication part ready to be used. It's cool, right, to think about the fixed header because you can have more than one API specification, right? In this example here, I'm on a free plan, so I can't register a new API. That is a new API definition, right? If I had some paid plan, right, I could register another one here, add a fixed header as well. So when I talk to the agent, through a natural language where the user is communicating with your agent, it will understand which API it needs to call and will already have all the information it needs to execute, right? So it has its positive points, and then it depends on an analysis to see what makes more sense. Once I saw that it correctly imported the API host and defined what I needed, I can save it or cancel it, right? And if you don't want this definition, you can come here and delete it, and it removes it, right? From two definitions. So once I have verified, done the check, everything is correct, I will now look at the pets. So we have the pet users, and within users, I have some actions I can take, such as listing all users, retrieving a user by the ID, creating a user, right? Things, if you all observe, you will see that each card of these actions has some with a different shade, right? It serves to indicate which actions are enabled, that is, which actions my agent can use. If I communicate with the agent now, automatically he will have or able to just call this action or that action. The others are hidden from him. So it's nice here because you can allow, right? And those you need through this selector. By default, when you do an upload in an open API team or do a search through a URL, all the methods that are of the get type come enabled, right? All of those for modification, whether delete, post, put, patch, those are disabled, right? So that you automatically come and check and activate only those you actually need. I can edit, right? I can see which values were filled in, right? By clicking on the little pencil. Let's take the get users one here. Then it brings the name, right? That was generated automatically, the type of request, which at the moment we are only supporting the HTTP request. A brief description, the path, right? Meaning /users, the method type, which is get, right? If I click, I can see here other options. And here I have 3 options that are quite important. And it's nice for us to comment on. It's different from just looking at the get now. So the users, for example, here I can use queries, right? Meaning I can search, for example, using an ID. So here in parameters, I need to instruct the agent what I can use as a filter, as a query for this pass. In our example here, we are only using the ID. So where do we have the definition? It is in the query. What is the name? ID. What type, right, of information? Is it an integer, a number, and whether it is mandatory or not? In this case here, it is not mandatory, right? The agent will only ask if you want to retrieve information from a specific ID. So when we're talking about get, and get methods, delete methods, you have to inform here so the agent understands how it can handle your route, right? That is what the possibilities are, right? To be able to handle a request from a user who uses your product, uses your SaaS. When we are talking about post or put, we have to focus a lot on the request because the definition of the request is what will determine, for example, which fields are mandatory for the user of your SaaS to fill in to create a record and which are optional. So this definition, when we insert it here, teaches the agent how to use your APIs and consequently respond to requests from your product. In the response part, it's not mandatory, okay, but it's always nice to include it as well. Why? Because in the same way, I use the other 2 fields, parameters, request, the response. The agent can understand how the response will come and how it can prepare to summarize this information and show that the action was successful for the user who is using your SaaS. And then we have the advanced options part, right? At this first moment, I will only talk about the requires confirmation because this field here is very important. In this case, I am editing a method that is get. With get methods, we do not modify records. We do not make changes to the database. So by default, the requires confirmation comes disabled. But if you wanted every request to ask for confirmation, even in the get, you could come here and mark this as true. In our case, as it is get, it is just recovering values. There is no change in the record. I come by default, and I personally also always leave it disabled. In our case, I will perform the cancel action since we made no changes. And I will look, let's look a little here at the create user up here. Is it possible to enable it? So you can see a bit of the difference from what I mentioned in our request. Look, you can see that now the parameter is null, right? Why? Because in fact, I am creating a user. So I don't need any path type parameter or much less query, right, to filter the record. However, then I have the request body. So in the request body, I have, for example, the definition of the fields. In other words, within properties, I have the name of the field, in this case, ID, its type, email, the type of his, right? And there is also a block that says which fields are mandatory. In this case, for this example, the fields are the first name and last name, which are mandatory. So this is what will teach our agent how to interact with the user of your product, right? What information to ask as mandatory, what information is optional, that it can leave to inform or update the subsequent record, right? So it's really important for these scenarios to have this mapped out. And all of them, right? It's worth remembering that we are going through them one by one here. For our example, we used a URL that had an open API specification, meaning it created all these records by itself. Everything was already configured. So if you have an open API file, if you have a URL that exposes the open API definition, automatically, in less than 2 minutes, you can is to import and automatically train your agent. So, okay, right, we talked about the request body, the response, same situation I mentioned before, and an important point here. Look, now you will see that the requires confirmation is enabled as true. In other words, it is mandatory that my agent, before executing anything, presents a summary to the user of your product, to the user of your SaaS, with the information they will enter, so that the user actually confirms, or if there is any incorrect data, they can request a correction before actually making the call, right, to your API, before coming here and making a post to batch users. This we are editing something that already came from the import I did. I could come here and add an action manually, right? I can come here and click on action and fill it in by hand. Imagine that you don't have a specification file, so you could have clicked here on new API, specify the API host, the headers. Then you could add the group, right? That is, when I click on group, it would be this block, right? That is, it would be its path. So imagine that we would have the user here. Imagine that we would have here, for example, the post. Imagine that I am talking about a social network, right? So I have the users of my social network, and I have the posts they created. I could create this guy, right, called posts, and here place the actions, meaning list a post, retrieve a post, delete a post, right? So we can do it manually, right? That is not having an API specification file, not having a URL that exposes this specification. Doesn't mean you can't use saaspilot, you can. You'll just have to make these configurations manually. So, okay, once I did that, I would already be able to use the agent. Here, for example, we will see that there is no authentication, right? Here, there is only the field definition, but we are not placing any authentication, neither here nor in the fixed header. Now, why? Because this test API is an open API. It is an API public, so we don't have, we don't need to provide any authentication. But to perform a test, look, I can put here, look.
Let's suppose
my header, and put 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we will see that in our playground test, it will take this header. So how do we do the test now? We go here to the playground. And in the playground, now I can perform the tests I need. Here in the playground, it's cool. You'll see that there's this developer mode, okay? It's always nice to keep it enabled. Why? Because you can see exactly the thought process of the agent, what action they chose, what the call was, how they made that call. So when you're implementing, it's really cool to enable the actions and come do the tests here. Speaking a little about the playground, but in a very succinct and quick way, we have 2 fields, okay? The user info is used for you. Specify some information related to that user who is interacting with your SaaS, with your product. For example, you can instruct it on how to interact, right? Whether to address by name or not, the way to greet, right? So here, very quickly, I'm saying for it to always confirm, greet politely, and always use my name, right? Whenever possible, use my name. And if I had, for example, imagine that in my header, which we put my header, if I had the customer ID, meaning customer ID is an ID that in theory, the user of your product, of your SaaS does not know, meaning it is an ID that you as the owner of your SaaS product use to identify companies or users. So I could come here and say something like, always use X value like customer ID. So it will automatically change the value in your header. It becomes much easier to read. So this field is also quite interesting for you to personalize responses, but also, yes, guide your agent to set values automatically without needing to keep asking. Okay. And here in the API key, we always put the value of your API key. If you are using it within the API specification, remember that I showed a block of authentication and a block of fixed header. So if I define in the authentication block that I'm going to use an authorization field and such, I need to come here to the API key and provide what this key will be, what the value of this key is. Why? Because the agent will take this key to use in the authentication part when calling your endpoint. So in our case, we don't need to provide it. Look, I added a greeting, I greeted, right? And automatically I asked him if he could bring the registered users. In other words, we have a get type root that returns all the users, right? So in theory, he would have the capability, right, to perform this search. So let's submit. Well, so we have the developer mode active here. So we can see what the line of thought was. In other words, his reasoning, right? So the user requested a list. So he understood that to be able to get it, he would have to search with the extra call get user. And here we can see the call that he actually made, right? So, oh, he really called our API, called for users, used the get method. And here would be the headers, right? Here he provided the authorization, right? Even though it's not needed, because I have an API key defined here and it's being used. But here it's interesting to look at this one. See, my header 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You can see that it automatically injected that fixed header we defined, which was a bit of what I had mentioned, right? Okay, and then automatically it brought here, right? It even says to the user, good evening, Glauber, here are the users. And here it listed all the users and their emails. So if we remove the developer mode, we will have a view that would be the view that your user interacting with your SaaS would see. So it's automatically, I send a good evening, and then it would simply respond with this message. Good evening, Glauber, here are your registered users. And it would display all the users, right? And at the end, if you need more information about the user, please let me know. So here it gives the final action. So we can, use any type of API. It's worth mentioning that this is an example API. There's no limitation, no pagination. So I brought everything. If it were other APIs or our own APIs where we have limits and pages, we can map all this directly in the action definition, right? If you have an API specification, it already comes with it. So that is the power we can have, right? Using SaaSpilot, we can bring a conversational experience into your product of your SaaS by making a direct integration with your APIs, right? And then in the next video, right, I will also talk about chat to docs, because you can bring your knowledge base into your APIs. So when the user interacts with your SaaS, it analyzes the way the user is asking, right, whether he has to clear up a doubt based on the knowledge base, or if he has to perform an action, such as bringing a user or listing all the users, listing all the products. I hope you enjoyed it. And the next video will cover a bit more about integrations